About chapter 29, section 3. And we're going to talk about how this war was not just a regional, not just a national, but a global conflict. And how it spread not just through Europe, but on several different continents. And how the nations of Germany and Britain and France and Russia were all in, meaning all of their resources totally committed to war. And what that looks. And so, as we're talking about how war affects the world, let's begin by jumping over to the Middle East. Yeah, the war that started in the Balkans, south of Austria, was also fought in the deserts of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and so the Allies had to not only invade on the Western Front, they also had to invade the Ottoman Empire. And so the hope was to defeat these people and to open a supply line to help Russia in fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a terrible defeat for the Allied powers. And so the point is that the war was not just fought in France, although many of the battles were there. It was fought in the Middle East. It was even fought in Africa. Remember that Germany and France and Britain all competing for colonies was one of the ultimate causes of this war. And so even though, again, the focus was in France, these battles were taking place in Asia, in Africa, and all over. And in the same vein, colonies from these places were being called upon to send troops. Aborigines from Australia wound up fighting in the trenches in Europe. Maasai tribesmen in Africa wound up in France at Verdun. And these people were being taken from all over the world, from their homes and from their distant villages, to fight in someone else's war. And of course, the United States got involved in 1917. And the war was, again, not just fought in the trenches, though those were where some of the more famous battles took place. The war was fought at sea. The United States was selling goods to Britain and France. Many of those goods were even weapons. And so the Germans, in an attempt to stop these goods from reaching Britain and France, began to sink convoys loaded with food and supplies and weapons and materials. And they were sinking those ships no matter what flag they were flying. This is called unrestricted submarine warfare. You see, Great Britain imposed a blockade on the North Sea, which is Germany's only access to the sea. And when they imposed this blockade, Germany could not get the food they needed. They could not get the supplies they needed. And as a result, more than 700,000 Germans starved to death. And as an act of revenge, the Germans instituted a counter blockade, saying any ship going for Britain or France will be sunk, because the Germans had developed the first submarines. The German term is undersea boot. They called them U-boats for short. And so they began sinking, again, any ship. Well, there was an American passenger liner. It was a cruise ship called the Lusitania. It's like the worst time to go on a cruise during a global war. And why would you go on a cruise that's bound for Britain, a nation at war? Not a good idea. But it doesn't change the fact that this happened. This cruise ship was headed toward Europe. It was carrying hundreds of Americans, hundreds of people from all over the world. And they were on a cruise. Sweet buffet, the water slide on the top, the swimming pool, the Lido deck in the back where you can sit and lounge and read a book. And then it was sunk by a German sub. Now, the Germans claimed that this cruise ship was carrying secret goods for Britain in the cargo hold. But nonetheless, this was the last straw for a lot of Americans. And in addition, the Germans had been in communication with Mexico. Yeah, in 1917 in Mexico, Mexico was very upset with the United States because in 1846 we invaded their country and we stole the lands of Arizona, New Mexico, and California, not to mention we supported Texas, who had rebelled against Mexico. And we brought Texas in to be a part of the United States. Mexico was furious about this. That's half their country. And so Germany began to secretly communicate with the Mexican government saying, if you start a war with the United States, we'll help you. We will help you retake those lands that were taken from you. And Mexico was seriously considering it. It was called the Zimmerman Note, named after the state official who was in charge of these communications. And somehow we found out about this. Again, here's that secret message shared between two confidants, and it got leaked. Don't ask me how it got leaked, but the word got out that Germany was talking to Mexico. And between that and the Lusitania and Russia was pulling out of the war, the United States joined the war. Meanwhile, the First World War by 1917 had gotten ugly. There's a fun little story about Christmas in 1914 in the trenches. On Christmas Day in 1914, in the trenches in Europe, the soldiers stopped fighting. They took the day off. They agreed to informal ceasefires up and down the line. And soldiers on both sides came out of their trenches, cooked a meal together, played soccer, exchanged addresses, and shook hands. And they sang songs, and some of them even gave each other Christmas presents. And then the next day, and in some cases these trenches were less than a mile apart. And so the next day, many of these soldiers went back to their trenches, saluted one another, and the war continued. It's called the Christmas Truce of 1914. I don't know of anything else like it, but it was the last of its kind in this war. Because by 1917, the war had grown ugly. Each of these governments were all in. And the governments had taken complete control of their people and their economy, and they were doing nothing but producing goods for war. Nations had turned to rationing. Their people were restricted of food and resources to make sure there was enough for the war itself. And at home, in all of these countries, women were taking jobs previously held by men, and women often served on the battlefields even as nurses. Here's an example of American propaganda. These posters could be seen everywhere from 1917 until the war was over. Because in fact, the United States wound up sending 3 million people. But in the same year that America joined the war, Russia dropped out. In 1917, the Russian people and the Russian government had grown so poor that people didn't have what they needed to survive. They stormed the palaces, they killed their government, and they started a new one. It was called the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a communist uprising. And the new government said, we are not going to fight this war anymore. And they withdrew. Meanwhile, Russia, the largest country in the world, was no longer in the fight. And Germany could focus their full efforts on France and Britain. But thanks to the United States and the 3 million fresh troops that we sent, Russia was eventually forced to sign a peace treaty. The term we use for this instance is an armistice. They agreed to a stalemate. Germany could have drugged this out. They could have fought a defensive war for no telling how long. But they agreed to a ceasefire. And it was a negotiated agreement. And we'll talk about the legacy of the war, and then we'll deal with its repercussions tomorrow. First off, the high price of war. 8.5 million soldiers died. 21 million wounded. As many civilians were killed in this as well. The war completely devastated European economies. It was a drain on national resources. It was one of the leading causes of the worldwide Great Depression in the 1930s. Many homes and villages were destroyed, and survivors had to pick up the pieces. Millions of people had become homeless and fleeing from this conflict. Millions of people were now dead. It disrupted social institutions. Many governments collapsed. Many economies collapsed. And it led to dark times after.